Okay, so off-payroll working rules, as I said, introduced in 2000, required that individuals who work like employees, but they're doing it through their own company, pay similar taxes to other employees. We've heard lots about it over the years. So there was reforms to that in the public sector in April 2017, and that was that the end client had to assess the employment status, and the fee payer had to deduct tax and national insurance. Now, effectively, what's happening from April 2020 is that those same rules should apply to medium and large private sector companies and also to third sector organisations. So again, just to reiterate, effectively that is saying that the end client, so it's not the personal services company, not the PSC, has got to determine the IR35 status of an assignment. Now, there's an exemption for small companies, and the small company is basically the small company as defined by the Companies Act. But that is that you must meet the definition of small as satisfy two out of three that criteria listed, which is annual turnover, the balance sheet total, and the number of employees. So you need to work out where you sit in terms of that. So a lot of this probably isn't going to apply specifically to the payroll department, because what I would expect is that the payroll department is going to receive that information from elsewhere. So the processes and procedures that we're going to talk about are really relating to the employer and what they have got to do and how they've got to assess, and then that assessment will be passed on to payroll to deal with. But I'll go through it so you can understand what the process is behind that. So the first bit is we have a contractor who's come in, and we need to work out whether that contract is inside or outside of IR35, so whether we put them through PAYE or not. And the primary considerations, these are the main ones we've got to look at, are it's the concept of substitution. So can someone who's coming in be substituted for someone else? And generally, well, not generally, an employee can't be. You are an employee as an individual employed in a contract. Control is another one. So what element of control is there? Who controls? Where is it you've got to work? What work have you got to do? How has that work got to be done? Who are you reporting to? All these sort of things will determine an employer-employer relationship. So if the control's there, it's much more likely to be an employee type relationship. And the last one the last main one, the mutuality of obligation, as it's called, is really all about is the employer obligated to provide work and then to pay for that work. So with a contractor, they come to the end of their contract, there is no obligation. With an employee, you've got an ongoing obligation. So there's three very obvious considerations there. There are secondary considerations as well. I've mentioned their equipment. It's probably a well-known one. If you provide your own equipment, a contractor may do that. If the employer provides the equipment, then it's much more likely to be employee. I've mentioned about insurance. Length of engagement is probably a good one. You'll have contractors who come in for a 6-month contract, but then it rolls on another 6 months, another 6 months, another year. So these are the sort of things that also need to be looked at as well. So as part of this, the employer needs to produce what's called a status determination statement, and I'm going to call that an STS because it's a bit wordy. Okay, so the result of the assessment is that the worker will get an STS. So that STS is going to go through the various tests, and it will then come back with a conclusion as to why a particular assessment conclusion has been reached. Now, the important thing is that once that assessment has been done, it needs to be provided to the worker. So that is effectively to the person who works for the company who's been engaged, who's probably a sole director of that company. But it also then needs to be cascaded to all parties in that labour supply chain. I've got a slide in the next one that shows that. One of the key things here is that all needs to be completed before the first payment is actually made to the PSC worker.
Sorry to interrupt there, Graham, but I just want to make sure, because a lot of the time the HMRC makes suggestions, and I just want to make sure that all of this is legislation.
This is all legislation. This is all something that that has to be followed.
Okay, great.
Although I'm pretty sure there are many grey areas in this.
Yes, just want to make sure that this is definitely legislation, not suggestion. Great.
Excuse me. I picked up this slide from HMRC, so thanks to them for this. It just seemed to be the best way of describing the process. So as you can see there, we've got the client on the left and we've got the worker on the right. So the worker is engaged to the client through the PSC, but then also in this case through an agency. So there can be multiple parts to the labour chain. So in this case here, the client, the end client, the one the worker is actually going to be engaged with, they must do an assessment of that worker to determine whether they are inside or outside of the IR35 rules. They will get the statement, the SDS, the worker will, and then the client will also cascade that down to, in this case, an agency, and that agency is the one who's actually, the employment has actually gone through. And the agency in this case may or may not be the fee payer as well, but it needs to go to the fee payer too. In this case, the agency is a fee payer. So you can have multiple organisations within that loop. Now, the other part of this is there is an appeal process that needs to be involved, because at any point there can be an appeal against the decision that's been made. So it's called a client-led disagreement appeal process. So it's to enable the individual or the fee payer to challenge the outcome of the assessment that's been made by the end client. It's all very complicated stuff, but effectively, as I said, at any stage, to basically challenge that outcome. So you can see there are 45 days for the client to respond in full to it, but it also, probably a key bit there is that if there's no agreement reached, the PSC can attempt to reclaim the tax and national insurance that have been paid. Okay, so what do companies need to do to prepare for it? I suppose one of the first obvious question is, does a small employer exemption apply? Because if it does, then you're not having to follow these rules. Excellent. Let's assume you do have to apply them. Well, what you should be doing is you should be reviewing any existing engagements you've got with contractors. So check the contracts, check the working practices, because existing contracts may fall into the IR35. Therefore, you need to think about off-payroll working going forward. You want to look at how that status is being determined. You know, how is it going to be made? Who's going to do it? There's a tool called CEST, which you should probably review. It's an HMR assessment tool, and it goes through a series of questions. I've got a quick slide in the next one. It'll just take a second to go through. One of the ones is to avoid making any blanket-based assessments. So if you've got a number of similar type roles, you probably don't want to go saying, right, these are all inside or these are all outside. Although again, one of the consequences of those rules are that companies are actually starting to do this. You maybe want to start looking at your recruitment onboarding policies, because that's where you're taking someone on. So it makes an awful lot of sense that it's at that point that these things are checked. You need to make sure you get appropriate resource, people are appropriately trained in the assessment process. I think overall what it's saying is you need to have robust processes in place, and you need to have them in place well ahead of time. Now, this has obviously been in the offing for quite some time. We're fairly close to it, so hopefully those of you who have got to do this have got those processes in place already. Anyway, the tool is a link there on the slides, and just to be clear, we will make these available, as Brittany said earlier.
Quick question for you. So will the HMRC be checking backdated workers before April 2020 to see if they should have been processed inside of IR35 through payroll?
I've actually got a slide on this afterwards.
Perfect.
But I'll just answer the question.
Perfect.
They have basically said that they will be concentrating on compliance going forward. but that's not going to say they're not going to
So
check
one of those
backwards.
suggestions.
So,
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anyway, this CES tool, it's not been getting particularly good write-ups. There's been lots of complaints about it, but I suppose the one thing is HMRC says it will stand by the outcome of it unless, as it says there, a compliance check finds information provided was inaccurate. So if you go by that and everything it's in is accurate, HMRC should accept what the outcome of your assessment is. So it's definitely worth reviewing that to see if it's of use to you. So direct implications for the payroll department. So by this time, we would hope that you have been given the assessment. You know that someone's come in. So really all you've got to do is put that person on the payroll. Because you, as the fee payer, as I said, that may be the end client, it may be the agency, but if you are the one who's actually processing that person, you need to put them on the payroll, but you need to flag them as an off-payroll worker. You need to deduct tax and employers' national insurance and corresponding employers' national insurance for that person, but that's all. So there's no student loan, there's no postgraduate loans, there's no court orders, there's no statutory payments, so SSP or S&P, etc. And auto enrollment doesn't apply. It's only tax and national insurance that is applicable. So one thing here is you may want to consider work undertaken before April 2020, but it's been paid for after. So that's just somebody's been worked in March, but getting paid in April, they potentially need to come into the off-payroll working. Apprenticeship levies should be automatically calculated off the bat by your payroll. When I say the employment allowance is excluded, the employer's national insurance, it can't be offset against employer's national insurance for off-payroll workers. The important thing about the off-payroll worker indicator you're putting on the payroll is actually to send to HMRC. It's sent via the FPS, but the important thing is it is there to tell HMRC not to send any student loan and postgraduate loan start notices. So you should stop seeing them come through. If they come through, you need to make sure you've got an off-payroll worker indicator set on your payroll system somewhere. So that's something basically to check, make sure your payroll software has that in place. Payslips, not mandatory, but similar as I said before, very much suggest that you include them for transparency purposes. From a disputes point of view, if there's a challenge to the outcome and that person who has been going through is no longer going through, you need a method of correcting that, and that's going to be through the FPS. And one final thing there is, it has been mentioned, about by some that setting up a separate paywise scheme. It's not necessary. However, the option is potentially there. Okay, so potential consequences. I kind of broached this a little bit about the having a sort of broad assessment across all. It's not the way. You probably shouldn't go down that route, but there's more and more doing it. So for example, the four main banks have said they are not going to deal with PSCs at all, and instead they're going to put all workers through PAYE. So I would expect you're going to get questions from workers asking how the rules are going to be implemented. That kind of makes sense, and how the assessment is going to be classified. You can expect that. I think the next one's interesting. It's reckoned that any contractors or anyone who considered themselves a contractor who's now going through the payroll is probably going to see a drop of 20 to 25% of their income. So I would say there's probably quite a substantial possibility that there'll be an upward pressure on the day rates, and there might be a need to renegotiate fees, but that's obviously up to each company. And exactly what Brittany just mentioned there about retrospective, that they're not focusing on that, it's going to be on new engagements. So there should be no targeted campaigns.